Hi everyone, welcome to the Mummy Movie Podcast, where we are looking at Ridley Scott's Exodus, Gods and Kings from 2014. Before we begin, this episode actually has a sponsor, and that sponsor is myself. So I have recently launched a Patreon page. I've put a link for this in the episode description, and it can also be found in the podcast's description as well. First things first, I want to assure everyone that this will not affect my weekly episodes. That's the last thing I want to happen. However, Patreons will get various perks, including, access to episodes early, extended episodes, and bonus episodes. I'm not going to go into all of the perks and features here, as I really don't want to ruin the flow of the episode. But if you feel you might be interested and want to know more, then please stick around until the end, as I will be discussing it more in the outro, going over the various tiers and so on. Anyway, let's get back to it. There are actually a few interesting facts about this film. So originally it was released in 3D, and this could explain why some of the backgrounds do look a little bit off, I guess. I mean, one thing I will say that I did notice is the birds in the film do look a little bit strange. They move strangely. But at the same time, this may just be because I was on the lookout for this. After all, I have seen this film a couple of times in the past, and it was only on this watch-through I noticed that. So I guess, actually, all things considered, it did a pretty good job, in all honesty. Definitely better than, let's say, Spy Kids 3. That film was originally 3D. It was actually, I believe, the first ever 3D film I saw. And then I remember watching it later when it came on the TV, and it just felt like every other scene had something flying towards the camera in an unnatural and incredibly digital way. Quite funny, I guess, but one thing I can say for Exodus, Gods and Kings is, like I said, I've seen this film a few times in the past, and I never even guessed at all that it was originally 3D, so the viewing is also pretty good in 2D. Interestingly, the film is banned in quite a few countries. It is banned in the United Arab Emirates, and also in Egypt itself. The reason for this ban has seemingly varied over time, I've noticed. But generally, it comes down to the misrepresentation of history and the portrayal of the Egyptians in an inaccurate and particularly brutal manner. I think realistically, we do have to realise that this film is also religious. It's about the Exodus from Egypt, so it was always going to be a bit controversial. Anyway, moving on. In terms of the format for this episode, it's going to be a little bit different. There was a lot to cover in this film, so I have had to split it into 2 episodes. When doing this, I've found in the past that trying to make 2 complete as possible episodes works best. They're the ones I tend to get the best feedback for. So in the first episode, I shall look at the historical accuracy of the majority of the film, and finally I shall review the first half of the film and just say whether I'm enjoying it up until that point. Then next week I shall more or less do the same. However, when it comes to the historical accuracy section, there will be a greater emphasis on, warfare, mainly when it comes to the Battle of Kadesh in the film, as there's a lot to talk about there. But before any of that, it is time for my dramatic intro. Right. You are an elite member of Egyptian society, almost viewed as the son of the pharaoh himself, Seti I. For much of your life, you have been on good terms with his actual son, Ramesside. However, as Seti grows close to death, tensions begin to form between you. It is clear that Seti would rather you be the next ruler of Egypt. Partly persuaded by this, Ramesside discovers some information about you. He finds out that you are not Egyptian at all. You were born a Hebrew, a slave of the Egyptians. As a result, he banishes you from society. But this is just the beginning of your journey, as now your true purpose reveals itself. The God of the Hebrews comes to you, the God of your people, and reveals that he wants you to be his general. He commands you to free his people from Egyptian rule. As such, a war is about to begin. A war that will involve an exodus, gods, and kings. Okay, we've now arrived at the historical accuracy section. So here, we shall simply look at the film, seeing what it gets right and wrong in terms of history, and also, using it as a bit of a springboard to talk about interesting things. And again, I just want to reiterate, I will not be focusing on the Battle of Kadesh scene here, as that's going to be the subject of next week's episode. The beginning of this film is said to be set in 1300 BC, during the reign of Seti I. This is slightly too early, all things considered. He was really ruling from around about 1290 BC, and his reign lasted for about 11 years, so we're looking at it ending in about 1279 BC. And of course, remember that these dates are very rough and definitely subject to change. But the point is, it does look like this film is set a little bit too early. Not massively, but just a little bit. We then see our first glance of ancient Egypt. Slaves cover the landscape, constructing all of the large monuments and buildings. Amongst these is a pyramid. I've spoken about this before in a podcast, but firstly, the pyramids were not built by slaves. They were very much built by skilled workers, and a lot of the time it was also the farmers who helped build the pyramids as well. So they would help during the inundation season, so the flood season, when they weren't really needed on the farms as much. The idea of the Israelites building the pyramids actually comes from the ancient writer Josephus in around about 93 or 94 AD, so quite a long time later. And in fact, even in the Bible itself, it is not stated that the Israelites built the pyramids. The second problem here is that pyramids just weren't being built during this time period. So Seti I reigned during the 19th dynasty, which was part of what is called the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom ran from the 18th dynasty until the end of the 20th dynasty. During this entire time period, outside of Amos I, who was the actual founder of the 18th dynasty, pretty much all of the pharaohs were buried in the Valley of the Kings. The reason they were buried here was because it was a hidden location just outside of the city of Thebes, so modern-day Luxor. And as such, it was less susceptible to tomb robbery, or at least that was the idea. It didn't really work out that way, all of them ended up getting robbed, but, that was what they were trying to do at least. But the point is, in no way, shape or form is having slaves building the pyramids in this time period accurate. Slaves wouldn't have built the pyramids, and the pyramids wouldn't have been being built at this time. The film then moves to the royal residence of King Seti in Memphis. In fairness, Memphis was indeed the royal residence of Seti I. That's where his capital was. However, later, when Ramesses II had come to the throne, Ramesses constructed a new capital in the northeastern delta, named Per-Ramesses. And interestingly, this is a place mentioned in the biblical story, so the Exodus story. It was actually supposed to be this city that a lot of the Hebrew slaves were working on. Going back to pyramids, as well as pyramids not being built during this time period, no pyramid has ever been found this far north in Egypt, so it's never been found as far north as Per-Ramesses. I spoke about this a little on my episode on Joseph, King of Dreams, the sequel to Prince of Egypt. I should just say, that film was actually pretty good and well worth watching. I genuinely think more people would rate it higher if it wasn't being compared to The Prince of Egypt. It's kind of a bit of a shame, to be honest. So I'm just going to give a quick shout out to that film. Anyway, going back to my argument. The most northerly pyramid found in Egypt is the pyramid of Afribis, just over 80 kilometers to the south of Per-Ramesses. So basically, regardless of whether you believe the biblical story or not, there is about as much chance as the Hebrews working on pyramids as there was for dinosaurs working on pyramids. Though interestingly, there is actually a conspiracy theory that says that dinosaurs built the pyramids. I'm not making that up, that's a genuine conspiracy theory out there. The idea is that they dragged the blocks. Personally, I feel there's, just a few issues with that theory. Soon after this opening shot, we see a woman reading the entrails of an animal, trying to predict the future about a coming battle. This was not actually a practice performed in ancient Egypt. This practice is, well, in Latin at least, is called haraspex, and, well, I guess in fairness it was practiced in the Near East, including by the Hittites who could be considered the biggest enemy of the Egyptians at this time. It was also used by the Babylonians, and even appears in the Bible, which I guess does make it appropriate for this film at least. However, this practice was most famously used by the Romans. It was not necessarily used to predict the future, although, well, obviously that does come into it. Instead, it was believed to help humans to understand the gods. Basically, it was believed that by reading the entrails of a sacrificed animal, you could discern whether the gods would approve or disapprove of coming actions. So, let's give an example. Let's say Rome was about to go to war. They would sacrifice an animal and read its entrails. If the reading was positive, then the gods would approve of the war. And if negative, then the gods would not approve of the war. Now, of course, this does not mean that the Romans were definitely going to win the coming war. It just meant that the gods were favourable of it. It was a good sign, but not a definite one. However, although the Egyptians didn't practice this kind of entrail reading, to our knowledge at least, there are hints of some other types of divination, so future predicting, if you will. For instance, we have some evidence for it at Deir el-Medina, the workman village that built the royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings and Queens. Here, a papyrus labelled Chester Beatty number 3 was found, and on this is what is called the Dream Book. Basically, to the Egyptians, dreams seem to stand outside of the regular bounds of space and time, and as such they thought that they contained sort of hidden meanings and secrets. The Dream Book was designed to, try and make sense of these. In general, it separates the different signs into either positive or negative attributes. So, for instance, seeing your family from afar in a dream was supposed to be a bad omen, and it meant that the dreamer was going to die. Another bad omen would be drinking warm beer, as this meant that suffering will come upon you. I guess the writer of the Dream Book really didn't like warm beer. But, by the same token, I guess he does. On a more positive note, if you are eating the flesh of a donkey in the dream, then this is a good sign. It means you will become great. And one that I admittedly find quite funny because I'm incredibly immature. If one's penis has enlarged in the dream, this is a good sign. It means an increase in possessions. So basically, there are signs of divination in ancient Egypt as well, just not in the way it's shown in the film. It is also worth noting that, although it is present in ancient Egypt, it's not that well attested. It's quite a rarity, if you will. Very shortly after this scene, Seti gives both Ramesses and Moses swords. On the handles of these swords, it is supposed to have the names of Ramesses and Moses. Unfortunately, these names are written in cartouches. So just for reference, a cartouche is a depiction of a ring of rope that normally had the pharaoh's name written inside of it. At this point in the film, Ramesses II is not supposed to be the pharaoh, and, well, Moses was never supposed to be the pharaoh, so it doesn't really make sense as to why their names would be written in a cartouche. One thing that I immediately noticed here as well is that, well, on the sword of Ramesses, it has the name Moses, and on the sword of Moses, it has the name of Ramesses, written in hieroglyphs. I will admit, at first I was ready to laugh at this because, well, I thought they'd made a really stupid mistake. But then, to the film's credit, Ramesses does point this out and he believes that Seti has given him the wrong sword. Seti then reveals that he has done this deliberately. He wants them to each have the sword with the other's name on it, so that they will always be bound together. Although the names here should not have been written in cartouches, I actually quite like this. I think it's an effective bit of symbolism, and, well, in fairness, the names are written correctly. Later in the film, we arrive at a particularly sombre scene. Seti I has just passed away, and we watch as a grand procession enters his tomb. I'm not going to lie, there are many issues with this scene. Firstly, the tomb he is being taken to, it's not a tomb at all, and it was actually built by Ramesses II, his son, hence the very big statues of Ramesses II outside of it. This is actually Abu Simbel, which is a few hours away from Aswan in southern Egypt. Remember I said earlier, Seti I would have been buried in the Valley of the Kings just outside of Thebes. Even today, that's a good 6-hour drive away from Abu Simbel. Secondly, there's a part where we see a lot of people in the inner part of the so-called tomb. This would have not been allowed, especially as many of these people have hair. Let me explain what I mean by that. Generally, to enter the inner parts of a tomb, or even a temple for that matter, you had to be purified. If you wanted to enter, you had to shave all of the hair from your head and body, and would have also had to, wash yourself as well. Even the mummy itself, before passing over the threshold, would have had to be purified with various aromatics and water from Nemset jars. So, again, more context, I guess. A Nemset jar is a spouted vessel, often made from alabaster, that would be used for libation and rituals. So, we've seen that this scene so far is very inaccurate, but I want to give it its props as well. On the upside, we also see the procession leading up to the tomb, and, well, this is correct. Normally there would have actually been 3 separate processions to the tomb. The first of these contained the actual deceased in their coffins. The second procession contained a shrine which held the canopic jars, and the final procession contained what is called the tekenu. This is something many of you probably have not heard of before, and in all honesty, it is because it's a very enigmatic thing. Well, we know quite a lot about the canopic jars, the jars that held the stomach, liver, intestines and kidneys of the deceased. As said, the tekenu is more enigmatic. There's a lot more debate over what its actual purpose was. In depictions, it is usually shown as a large cattle skin filled with something unknown. Many Egyptologists, such as Selina Ikram and Assmann, believe that this may have been the remnants of the embalming process. However, other interpretations do exist. For instance, Taylor believes that the tekenu may have been a ritualistic sacrifice for the deceased. A kind of scapegoat that may have absorbed the deceased's evil deeds in life. Meanwhile, Campbell, another Egyptologist, came up with the idea that maybe the deceased had to pass through this skin in order for their soul to be restored to them in the afterlife. So, as you can see, there are various interpretations for this, but realistically, we just don't entirely know. Therefore, overall, from the points I have raised so far, the film is, well, hardly accurate. We have slaves building the pyramids at a time when pyramids were being built. We have a woman reading entrails, which was not an Egyptian practice. We have the names of Ramesses and Moses in cartouches, before Ramesses was pharaoh, that is. However, on the upside, at least the names are written here correctly, and although the funeral scene is incredibly bad in terms of historical accuracy, at least they do show a procession leading up to the tomb. Okay, we've now arrived at the review section. So here I shall simply go over, I suppose, roughly the first half of the film, saying what I liked and disliked about it, and then I'll just give my impressions on the film up until that point. First things first, I will say, probably because it is a big blockbuster, the film does look incredibly nice, and the acting is also pretty good as well. Hardly surprising, I suppose, considering it stars Christian Bale. I mean, think what you want of him, he is an incredible actor, there's no way around that. On top of that, I actually quite like the score of the film. Don't get me wrong, by no means is it the best score I've ever heard, but it's suitable for the film and it does give it the appropriately epic feel. Further, when it comes to the swords of Ramesses and Moses, the ones that Seti gave them, although the name shouldn't have been in cartouches, I actually really like the idea that the film's come up with here. You know, the idea that Ramesses has a sword that has Moses written on it, whilst Moses has a sword that's got Ramesses written on it. I especially like that they keep focusing on these swords as the relationship between Moses and Ramesses becomes more and more fragmentary. It's a really nice bit of symbolism that kind of shows how they can't quite let each other go, how there's still that glimmer of hope that the friendship might last in some way. I do think maybe they should have even focused on this a little bit more, but for me at least it did add a level of subtle emotion into the film. It kind of emphasised that Moses and Ramesses did have a long history, and that's appropriate as they'd essentially grown up with each other. So I found this really effective. However, on the downside, first things first, Christian Bale's hair is hysterically modern at the beginning of this film. It really does kind of take away from my immersion a little bit, though in fairness I suppose it does change and become more rugged as the film goes on. On top of that, I don't know if this next point is a little bit unfair of me, but I will admit whenever I watch this film, I tend to compare it to other versions of the Moses story, so the likes of the Prince of Egypt or the Ten Commandments, and honestly, I don't think that this one compares. For instance, the relationship between Moses and Ramesses here is a little bit of a mess, all things considered. Don't get me wrong, as I said a second ago, I did like the whole sword symbolism, but for a large part of the film, Ramesses just seems a bit bipolar. One moment he and Moses are best friends, and the next they're just enemies. When you compare that to the Prince of Egypt, the difference is, it's night and day. That film had a well-crafted friendship. It showed regret on both sides. When Ramesses acted up in that one, it was because he felt hurt. In this one, it just kind of felt like Ramesses went, I'm evil now. And unsurprisingly, that's not good enough. I'm going to go into this more next episode, but I honestly feel that this is because the film wasn't long enough to, effectively develop the relationships between the characters. This may sound strange as the film is 2.5 hours, but realistically it's also got a kind of epic setting to it, and those kind of films, especially with a story like this, do need more time. And okay, you could argue that The Prince of Egypt is much shorter than this film and does a far better job, but by the same token, it's a completely different genre of film. As said, this is supposed to be a big, sweeping epic. Although I do tend to think films nowadays are a bit too long, this genre is the exception. This genre does need that time. Nevertheless, at the halfway point, I will say I am still enjoying this film. It does have the feel of, a kind of film you put on in the background during a lazy afternoon. And I do have a bit of a soft spot for that type of film. It kind of reminds me of the old 1950s epics in that regard. So, at the halfway point, I would hardly say this film is, outstanding. It's not the best film ever made. It's definitely very flawed. But I also think it's solid enough. Thank you very much for listening. I certainly hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you have, why not like the episode, write a review for the podcast, subscribe, and, why not check out my new Patreon page as well. Just to explain a little bit more about this and what you will receive, there will be 2 tiers. For $3 a month, you will get to dive into all episodes a full 2 days before everyone else. Then, when listening on my Patreon page, you will also not have to worry about adverts cutting into the programming. On top of this, you will get to become part of the decision-making, as there will be polls to see, things like what film I should cover next and things like that. And finally, you will gain access to the occasional extended episode. Basically, sometimes we have to trim content down due to time constraints or younger audience considerations, especially when it comes to the guested episodes. Here, you will get the full, uncut experience. Then, for $5 a month, you will unlock all of the exclusive perks I've already mentioned, plus you will gain access to special bonus episodes, only available at this highest tier. These episodes are typically more kind of history-based, and they focus on areas that I would love to talk about on the podcast, but that just don't typically come up. As I said at the beginning, this will not affect my weekly episodes. However, if you are interested in seeing more of the podcast, or just, even just supporting me, I really would appreciate it. Please do check out my Patreon page. As I said, there is a link for it in the episode description and also in the podcast's description as well. And also just on the podcast's website now I think about it as well. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and join me next Monday where we shall continue to look at Exodus, Gods and Kings. I hope you all have an excellent week, and see you then.